Is it worth it?
Yeah.
You are looking live at 306 Arlington Christian School, 28 Pittsburgh Street, Columbia, Ohio. 44408.
I ran into Tuxedo in the daily.
Longitude 80 point something west, latitude 40 point something north. Almost 8141. All right. Yesterday we left off with this, the era of good feelings, and I'm re-emphasizing this right here. Look, I know that you're students and you're taking notes, and all you care about is taking the notes and getting the good grade on the test. But those of you that like to think about and learn history for the sake of learning history because you enjoy it, this is a very, very, very important thing that happened here. Think about what happened. James Monroe, the President of the United States, is telling the world that America has arrived, and America's prominence now and our dominance in history over the last 200 years can be traced back to this statement. This part of the world is America's interest. Europe is not yours. So Portugal and Spain that started all of this exploration in the New World. And then England and France and all of those in the Netherlands, all those people, the Dutch that were exploring the New World. America is now a country, not only a country, we've defeated the greatest army in the world to gain our independence. We defeated them again in the War of 1812. Our Navy is expanding. We are on the world stage, and we are here to proclaim that if you want to mess with what's going on this side of the world, all negotiations go through America. We control the Western Hemisphere. All right. Jacksonian democracy.
Do you have something to say?
Did you miss that day? Did you miss yesterday?
No, I didn't.
Jacksonian democracy. The three major tenets of Jacksonian democracy were nationalism, sectionalism, and democratization. We talked about those things. This big deal that Andrew Jackson won in 1824, and then in 1828, there were twice as many voters, as an indication of how democracy had grown. All adult white males have the right to vote. Of course, we know it's going to be 100 years before all adult white women have the right to vote. And we know it's going to be 40 or 50 years almost from this that black men have the right to vote. All right, we're going to start today with, we talked about at the beginning of the year. If you haven't picked up on it, I don't just teach American history. I love American history, and I love the foundation of our country. I love the biblical foundation of our country. My patriotism is distinctly tied to my biblical worldview and my perspective of the world, how I wish, I pray that there would be revival in America and there would be a third great awakening. But we also have to talk about America's not perfect. And we mentioned that this isn't heaven. This is a place run by human beings that are flawed and sinful. And not all of our leaders throughout our history have been Christian. In civics, we talk about that a lot. We haven't talked about it a lot in here, but you know, the great people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin, you will be taught at some point in your history, or someone will try to persuade you about America's not a biblical or Christian country because those people weren't committed Christians. Whether they were committed Christians or not, there is a slew. Even if they weren't committed Christians, they knew that living biblically was the best way to live, and they promoted a Christian society, even if they weren't totally sold out for Christ themselves. But anyway, we also have people that weren't Christian and didn't even try to hide that they weren't Christian. Having said all that, it doesn't mean that Andrew Jackson, I can't judge whether he was Christian or not, but he was president at the time, and he ran as president, and the people that voted for him kind of knew that one of the pillars of his platform was that as we expand to the West and we continue to grow as a country, we've got to figure out what to do with the problem that we're still having in the 1820s with Native Americans in general, as we expand, right? And then, like, is it okay to have a country within a country? I'm sorry, a nation within a country? Like, one of the things that people bring up all the time about America being the melting pot, or the place, you've heard that term before, where we're built on immigration, right? We got people from all over the world that have come to America. How has it worked? It's worked because when people come, they might come from Italy or Ireland or Saudi Arabia or the Ukraine. I'm sorry, from Ukraine. I even slip into saying that sometimes. Or Russia, or wherever they come from, or China, and they do this thing called assimilate into American culture, right? America wouldn't work as well and as smoothly if all those people came and they decided that they were just going to live the Chinese way of life, or the Ukrainian way of life, or the Italian, you know what I mean? So they learn English, they do all the things, and we become this kind of place with all this diversity, but yet unity. Does that make sense? We have unity for the most part through our history, even though we have all this diversity, because people buy into the American system. Well, some people back in the 1820s were like, look, if we're going to continue to build this, we can't have groups of people, Native Americans, maintaining that this is our land and this is our way of life. It didn't seem compatible. And then the result of that was Trail of Tears, which, no matter what you think of America, not a good thing. Okay, very ugly part of our history. Something that we have to, why do we learn history? To learn from the past, right? But what the anti-love for America's foundation people crowd do is they'll take a thing like this and they think that smears all of history. Oh, America's not a great country because look, what you're about to watch is awful. What you're about to learn about is awful. Yes.
In other countries, since there's not as much diversity, can you get other cultures' foods as easily? Like, you know, here we can get like Italian food, Mexican, Chinese on like every town.
Yeah. Yeah. Good
But
question.
in other places, do they not have that?
I am not a
too
world
sparse?
traveler, so I really don't know. Anybody know anything about that?
Yeah, you travel.
Derek, you've gone to France.
Kind of Europe, I don't know.
What's the gentleman's name? Is he in your class? Freshman? He's like a missionary. He's been like,
Yeah, the Greece.
Greece also.
Like a pass.
I was just saying, I want to talk to him sometime because he seems like he's probably got a wealth of knowledge, not in the classroom, just like being all these places.
Like fancy and bread.
When have you ever been to France?
Oh.
Okay.
People at the time knew it was wrong. People at the time
Lights,
knew it
please.
was illegal. People at the time knew it was unconstitutional. And it happened anyway. The Trail of Tears shouldn't have happened. At some level, I'm making a moral statement, a normative claim, that the United States should not have forcibly removed the Cherokee Nation from its homeland in 1838 and 1839. This split apart a unified people who had chosen to live together for centuries, organizing themselves around a sophisticated common law with a capital and recognized regions and all 7 family clans represented in every town. This was a people that wanted to live together, who had, as Augustine said, loved things held in common, and they were sundered apart by coercion. Now, the Cherokees are found in the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, the Eastern Band of Cherokees in North Carolina, and in various other communities across the United States and even Mexico. No longer the coherent nation they had been. Obviously, it was wrong when we consider the loss of life that took place in the forceful removal of the Cherokees from their home in the southeast to what was Indian Territory, now the state of Oklahoma in the Midwest. The official U.S. reports suggest that roughly 400 people died. We know that, in fact, at least that many died in the containment centers where they were rounded up, the camps where they were held before removal even physically happened, before the marches. The marches that took place over 2,200 miles of land and sea routes, moving the people from the east to the Midwest. The people who witnessed the Trail of Tears, people who were landowners in areas where the Trail of Tears went past, or missionaries, or people who traveled for one reason or another with the Cherokees, suggest that the number was more like 4,000 instead of 400. Today, scholars think that's probably a conservative figure. Somewhere between a quarter and a third of the Cherokee Nation was lost during the Trail of Tears. And those who were lost were those who were least likely to be able to endure starvation, exposure to the elements, marching 10 miles a day in knee-deep snow, for example. In other words, the elderly and the infants. So that the bulk of the Cherokee Nation arrived in Indian Territory without its past and without its future, without its oldest and youngest members. It's also a moral wrong because one of the arguments used to justify the Trail of Tears was bald-faced lie, the idea that the Cherokees would not be comfortable in the environment of the new United States. But the fact is, by the 1830s, the Cherokees had a written language, a written and ratified constitution, a bilingual national press, a bilingual national newspaper, institutions of higher learning for both men and women. Some scholars suggest a significantly higher literacy rate for the Cherokees than for members of the surrounding states. The idea that Cherokees could not adapt, could not somehow assimilate with the culture is ridiculous. But it was a justification for taking things away from Cherokees and giving them to U.S. citizens. But my statement that the Cherokee Trail of Tears shouldn't have happened is more than just a moral claim. It's an objective statement of fact. There are several reasons for this. One, constitutionally, it should never have happened. When it became clear that people in the United States who favored Indian removal were not content to wait until Cherokee citizens were willing to sell their property. Obviously, the Cherokees did not want to move from their homeland. It turned out that a number of people looked to the state of Georgia to press the issue, to force it. And the Georgians were more than happy to do so. The Georgia state legislature tried essentially to write the Cherokee Nation out of existence, dissolve it, not recognize its borders or its laws or its constitution, to try to take its property and give it to Georgia citizens. One of the means they tried using in order to do this was to suggest that anyone who wasn't Cherokee, who lived among the Cherokees, had to get permission from the state of Georgia to do so. And there were a number of people who were not interested in doing this. Some of them were white missionaries who lived and worked with the Cherokees, were there by Cherokee invitation and consent. For example, Samuel Worcester worked with the Cherokee press, helped translate documents and such, hymns and scripture. And these people said, we don't have to get permission from anyone else but Cherokees in order to live among the Cherokees. The state of Georgia pressed the issue, arrested them, and sentenced them to hard labor, this particular group of missionaries, for acting outside of Georgia law. And so you had these missionaries imprisoned, and this was a chance for the Cherokees to challenge what Georgia was doing. And so they pressed forward with the case Worcester v. the State of Georgia, which they took to the Supreme Court of the United States in 1832. You know what? The Supreme Court agreed with the Cherokees. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, decided that in fact, Georgia, like every other state in the nation, had to recognize the sovereignty of the Cherokees, and that the relationship was not between the Cherokees and the states, but the Cherokees and the national government. The national government had agreed to recognize the Cherokee Nation and its borders and its laws. That seemed like a good thing, but in fact, then President Andrew Jackson, who had run for the presidency on the platform of Indian removal, refused to execute the decision. This represented a failure of the checks and balances system of the U.S. government. The executive ignored judiciary, and So even though the Cherokees won the case of Worcester v. Georgia, they lost because Andrew Jackson refused to recognize the legitimacy of the decision. There's another way in which this shouldn't have happened legally, and that is the Treaty of New Echota in 1835, which was used to justify the physical act of removal of the Cherokee Nation, even though it was a completely invalid treaty and everybody knew it. What happened was a small group of Cherokees, we're talking maybe 30 maximum, Cherokee citizens, became convinced that the situation was coming to a head, and the choice was between Cherokee property and Cherokee lives. They believed that if the Cherokees remained in their homeland, which every Cherokee wanted to do, they would in fact be eradicated. That this was a point at which the only way to survive as a nation was to leave. And so they pursued a treaty with the United States, even though none of them held elected office. None of them were legitimate representatives of the government. And in fact, this is one of the sad ironies, two of them had been instrumental in shaping the new Cherokee Constitution, that in fact made it a capital offense to do exactly what they were going to do, and that is misrepresent the will of the Cherokee people and make a decision to cede Cherokee national land. They did it anyway, even knowing that they were committing suicide by signing this treaty, because they believed it was the only way that the Cherokee Nation as a whole would survive. What happened is what you would expect. Immediately after the treaty was signed, ceding land in the east for land in the west is what would become Indian Territory, what would later become the state of Oklahoma. The justly elected leaders of the Cherokee Nation stood up and said, this doesn't represent the will of the Cherokee people. This is completely illegitimate. You can't ratify a treaty you know was only with a handful of private Cherokee citizens. The principal chief, John Ross, was doggedly determined to fight this at every level. He tried to speak to then President Martin Van Buren without success. He tried to speak to the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs without success. He put together a petition with over 15,600 signatures of Cherokee citizens, and he took it to the Senate to show that the vast majority of the Cherokee Nation was an outcry, the idea that they could be forcibly removed on the basis of something that was clearly illegitimate. On the day he was due to present the petition with all of these autographs, all of these signatures, in front of Congress in fact took a day off because two congressmen had a duel and one killed the other, and so they had a day of mourning in memory of that gentleman. And in fact, Principal Chief John Ross never had the opportunity to show Congress his list of signatures. By the time the Senate was reconvened, Ross's opportunity had passed, and the Trail of Tears was in fact imminent. There are lessons we should take from the fact that the Trail of Tears shouldn't have happened, that the U.S. moved forward first with actions that were unconstitutional, second with actions that were illegal, that really this had been a decision of first the Jackson administration and then later the Van Buren administration, and the embodiment of the will of a certain faction of the United States citizenry, particularly those who were set to benefit from this massive redistribution of Cherokee lands, not just physical lands, but homes and businesses and farms and improvements, because the Cherokees were allowed essentially all that they could carry on their back and nothing more. And so in a way, we think about the Trail of Tears as a massive redistribution scheme in which people who had no legal recourse, a minority that could not defend themselves, well they did, they went all the way to the Supreme Court and won, but still didn't have the might of state guns behind them essentially, lost everything they had so that it could be given to people who had nothing and wanted it and had to vote in support of the national government. So what can we take away from this? One is that this is a precedent-setting move, not just because it was a time in which the president refused to execute the decisions of the judiciary, not just because treaties that were invalid were ratified nonetheless. This was, if we apply retroactively the definition of ethnic cleansing currently used by the United Nations, this was an act of ethnic cleansing. It's a moment for us to have humility in U.S. History, to recognize that acts of ethnic cleansing don't just simply happen in other parts of the world in other times, but in fact it's a part of the fabric of our national history and our national consciousness. We should also remember the people on both sides who stood up against the Trail of Tears. We could look at it and say, oh, this was inevitable. This is something that was going to happen. In fact, if we look with our own anachronistic perspective and retroactively try to apply it, we're just doing a disservice to everyone involved. But that's not the case. People at the time knew it was wrong, and there were people of courage who stood up and said so. There were great leaders on the side of the Cherokees, including Principal Chief John Ross. There were also people on the side of the United States people of conscience, people of law, who stood up for the Cherokee Nation. One of the examples of someone who, lost his political career was Davy Crockett. Now, when we think of Davy Crockett, we usually think of him either as a so-called Indian fighter or as that guy from the Alamo. Well, there was a reason he was at the Alamo, and that was because he was trying to get as far away from Washington as possible. He became, after his frontiersman days, a congressman and was a part of Jackson's administration. Or Jackson's good movement, I should say. But he fundamentally disagreed with Jackson about removal. He said there was a difference between fighting, between defending oneself, and going into someone's home and stealing all their stuff and shooting them in the back. He saw it as a cowardly and tremendously immoral act, the notion of moving removal. And so he stood up against Jackson and was told that he would be willing, and he did it anyway, and he was. And so in the end, he was at the Alamo because he was no longer in Washington because he stood up for, among others, the Cherokee Nation. Another example of someone who knew at the time that this was wrong was Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of the great intellectuals of the United States at the time. He wrote a public letter that went to then President Martin Van Buren. It was also published widely in newspapers and such, protesting the removal of the Cherokee Nation. And here is part of what Emerson said to Van Buren. Such a dereliction of all faith and virtue, such a denial of justice, and such deafness to screams for mercy were never heard of in times of peace, and the dealing of a nation with its own allies and wars, since the earth was made. Sir, does this government think that the people of the United States are to be savage and mad? From their mind are the sentiments of love and of good nature wiped clean out? The soul of man, justice, the mercy that is the heart's heart in all men, from Maine to Georgia, does abhor this business. And he went on to tell the president that if he pursued the plan of removing the Cherokee Nation, that not only would the United States as a whole, but the presidency in particular, stink to all of the world. Emerson obviously didn't change U.S. policy, neither did Davy Crockett or former President John Quincy Adams or any of the others who stood up. But their words speak to us for a variety of reasons today. They remind us that individuals did and can overcome prejudice in order to see a common humanity. And they suggest that we can't look aside and ignore the Trail of Tears as an example of something that was just part of the mid-19th century mindset. One group which did have access to power gained, and one group which was denied power lost. That's one of the reasons we should remember the Trail of Tears, and the fact that it set precedents that hopefully in the future we can repeat.
Because those who don't remember the past are
Condemned to repeat it for
condemned, destined. Any questions, comments?
No.
Andrew Jackson.
I saw you showed us that.
That's Jackson.
I don't know why.
No, I knew it was coming.
All right. No questions or comments? Moving on. Speaking of destiny, before we get to manifest destiny, we have to mention in our attempt to consolidate all of this history into a week that there was something called the Whig Party. It was mentioned in that video that rose up in the 1830s as anti-Jackson nationalists. And in fact, they referred to Andrew Jackson as Andrew the First. What was the point to that? What were they saying? If they called him Andrew the First, what were they implying? That he thinks he's king, right? Also of note, the birth of the Whig Party in the 1830s, someone very significant later in American politics gets elected to the House of Representatives. So this is where Abraham Lincoln comes on the political scene. In the 1830s, with the Whig Party. Am I the only one? When I was in your seat, I was like, Whig Party? It just seemed really weird. Everybody good?
Yes.
Well, you've heard of this term before, right? Manifest destiny. Destiny. It's like, hey, it's bound to happen, right? Manifest. It happens. It's happening. It's obvious it's going to happen. Isn't our destiny obvious? We are going to go from sea to shining sea. The people that were living at the time, as noted by New York reporter, journalist John Lewis O'Sullivan said, and this is where the term comes from, by the way, it was first used by this journalist, our manifest destiny to overspread to possess the North American continent, which Providence has given us. What's that suggesting? We are going to spread from sea to shining sea. This idea of America occupying the whole of North America is directed by God himself, Providence. It's just going to happen. Like she said in the video, we look back on it, and even people living back then, look, it was inevitable. It's inevitable. We can't allow groups of Native Americans to just be their own nation. And how's that going to help the whole country as a whole grow in unity? It's just going to happen. And in fact, you go a little deeper then. God has ordained it. Look what God has done, how he's blessed the country, going back to General Washington, establishment of the country. All the things that have happened that have fell the way of this growing nation. Our destiny is obvious. Well, as I was picking and choosing what to mention in this part of history, I thought it was important that we recognize two very influential families that were missions in the West. One was in the territory called Oregon. You don't necessarily have to think of the state of Oregon right now, but out there in the Northwest, the Oregon Territory, there was a family called the Whitmans, and they were very influential in being missionaries to the native people that were there, but also to the people that were moving there, and their efforts really opened up this territory. The population of the Oregon Territory grew and grew. And when we say Oregon Territory, we're talking about Oregon, Washington, Idaho, into California, and then the Spaldings in Idaho, working especially with the Nez Perce Indians. By the way, the Whitmans, for their efforts, ended up being killed. Which shouldn't discourage you from being missionaries, by the way. I'm sure they thought and believed their work. It's its own republic. has the nickname the Lone Star State because for a period of time, Texas, after gaining its independence from Mexico, it was its own republic before being drafted into the United States. Growing pains. As we grow west, we just talked about the growing pains and what to do with the Native Americans that are here. How do we keep expanding without removing them? Push them to the west, give them that territory. Then we're gonna push them out of there, right? What about Mexico? They're just gonna say, here, you can have it? No. There were three main trails to the west. One was called the Oregon Trail, so you picture that being northern. One was called the Santa Fe Trail down in New Mexico. You can picture that being kind of a southern trail. And then there was one more central called the Mormon Trail. These weren't the only avenues to the west, but